My offer to him, to Peter Bassett, still stands. If he wants to discuss this with me on Skype, I'm very prepared to do so, but only him and him only. I'm not interested in debating anybody else. I'm done with that. But I'll leave it open for him for a while. But then I'll probably retract that. I'm just not, I'm not wasting my energies on that anymore. But he really, like, in some of the email exchanges I had with him, was just incredible. Like, he even brought up stuff that had nothing to do with the Apollo mission. He says, oh, you conspiracy theorists are all the same. And it reminds me of a paper, and you were talking interesting enough about the radiation with Braddock on the Van Allen belts. What interested me with him was number one, he was using theoretical models. He had no real-time information. He was making the determination that it was safe, in his opinion, to go from here to here through the Van Allen belts. In his opinion. That's all it is. It's an opinion piece. He uses a lot of math. Give him credit for that, but it's an opinion piece. But what I found very interesting about his paper is that he spent a quarter of that paper trying to discredit conspiracy theorists. So what was his real motivation here? I'm curious to get your views on that.
The Apollo parrots, those people who support the Apollo story, who always big up NASA, they have to do it because there's a sort of small group of these people who all have to agree with each other. Because if one of them steps out of line, they will be trashed big time by the rest of them. So they have to maintain the story, the fiction of Apollo. They have to maintain that. And if they're seen not to maintain it, or to even to enter a discussion with people like you or me or Bart or any of the other people who challenge NASA, if any of the Apollo parrots, the supporters of Apollo, the groupies, are seen to engage with us, which is why you will find Peter Bassett won't engage with you at all, because he knows what would happen. He knows he would be shown up for being a bit of an incompetent idiot, which most of them are, because they don't address the problem. They don't use the science to address the problem. They assert it. They say, this is what NASA says. That's argument from authority. This is the science. This is argument from authority again. They use that all the time. And they don't dare challenge NASA the way we have, because they know what would happen. They would just be ostracized by anybody in their community. And it's a very small community. And ironically, there are several of them in the UK. I think it's the only other country other than America where these Apollo parrots inhabit. Maybe it's just not a suitable place for them to go anywhere else. Well, there's Attabissimo lives in Italy, and he's done the same thing, but he's also, he's a contributor to the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. Now, I say that the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal is basically a film script because it's timed to the nearest second, which is what film scripts are. They're timed to the nearest second. It's called storyboarding. They lay out the story. They know exactly where they have to point the camera. They know what actors are going to be on set at any given time. They know how long the scene is supposed to last for. Making a film is a very complex business. It's been refined now. It's much easier now with digital cameras. They know how long the scene has to last because it's been timed. Because eventually all the scenes will be put together and the film will last, say, 90 minutes or 120 minutes. So they have to know what they can get into that time. With Apollo, they had a lot more time, but they did do it in real time. They simulated it in real time. And they had changes of staff, changes of personnel at Johnson Space Center, at Kennedy Space Center. Gene Kranz, he was there for the odd-numbered Apollo missions. When you get one of the major figures in the Apollo program saying on camera, oh, we don't know where that information is. This is referring to the telemetry tapes, which were supposed to be recording it all. No, we don't seem to have those. And anyway, if we did find them, we couldn't play them back. We don't have the equipment now to do it. What's going on? We can still play cinema films that were shot 100 years ago on a very unstable acetate base because they can be converted and played on modern equipment. But the Apollo missions, the tapes have gone. There's no official record, which is one of the most ridiculous situations. This is supposed to be the event of the century. Don't you think they might have kept a few records? Oh, come on, guys. You know, all this talk about the Apollo missions couldn't possibly be anything other than real is nonsense. You have adjusted it. What Scott has found in his research is that NASA are now altering the record. Yeah, they're altering some of the photographs, because we've seen it. The famous photograph of man on the moon, that's allegedly Aldrin on the moon, photographed by Armstrong. The original photograph shows a lot of fall off, which is a photographic term, means that if it was illuminated by the sun, the background, in this case the surface of the moon, assuming it's that, would be illuminated the same intensity from the foreground as far as you can see to the background. In the case of the moon, assuming it's on the moon, it's about 2 miles away. It would be illuminated to the same degree. Well, what we see is what's called fall off, where the light appears to be brighter in certain areas than others. The light is falling off. So indicating it was shot inside with artificial light. Artificial light is not strong enough on its own to illuminate something 2 miles wide. You can apply the inverse square law to see how much light you...
Sorry to interrupt you. Blue Earth thing and his inverse square law on that. I mean, it's just, you know, I don't know much about photography, and I don't pretend to, and I made that very clear, but I don't have to know a lot about photography to know a ruse when I see one, and that's why I put your work and others' work in the appendix of the book, and I let the reader decide for themselves. It just makes common sense to me when you look at the lunar surface and you see that picture of Buzz Aldrin standing there, and the light drops off, considering that they're on the sunlit side of the moon with no atmosphere. The whole area should be illuminated in a uniform state. It just defies common sense that that's not happening, and I'll be ridiculed for saying that. I love it.
So NASA are desperately trying to recover the ground that they have lost, because more and more people now have access to this information. Scott has identified a lot of PDF records that have been altered.
There was one great line in the Oliver Stone's movie JFK, when Jim Garrison's talking to the jury, and he says, the government says it can prove its case that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. And he says, sure they can. They can prove that an elephant can hang from a cliff with its tail tied to a daisy. With some fancy physics in the lab, they can prove anything. But you use your eyes, your common sense, and you know that to be not true. And that's exactly what is happening here with the Apollo missions. You use your eyes, you use your common sense. Everybody has it. We all have it. We even have a powerful trait called intuition. That's very powerful. Science likes to ignore that, but you can't deny it. It's real, and it's happening right now on a mass scale, on a mass level. So that's an example, too, of what you're talking about, and I always like to point that out, that don't be intimidated. I say to people, don't be intimidated by physicists and PhDs. You have the ability to look at this for yourselves. You have the ability to decide for yourselves, and that's what I encourage everyone to do. I'm not telling people this is what it is. I'm asking people to, read my books or don't read my books. That's up to you. Read the other books that you mentioned. I think Mary Bennett and David Percy probably wrote the definitive book on this. But read all of them. Read the books on the official version. Read them too. Then decide, right, for yourselves. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a lot of work, but then you decide.
David's and Mary's book was called Dark Moon. And it was called Dark Moon for a very simple reason. You've actually explained it already. If Apollo 13 had landed where it was supposed to land without all the exploding oxygen tanks, if it had landed where it was supposed to land, when it was supposed to land, it would have been in darkness, just like you described. Hence, Dark Moon. Maybe they got the simulation wrong. Maybe they got timing wrong. It's possible. And maybe they had to get themselves out of a very, very deep hole. So they come up with this idea, we'll explode an oxygen tank. That'll be fun. Then we can rescue them. And that'll be fun. And then we can be heroes again. That'll be fun. This is a film script, don't forget. It's totally adaptable at any point in the film. And also one other point, which I think every Apollo mission, the only part of the Apollo craft that returned to Earth after we saw the bloody great rocket taking off, 365 foot high, The only part of that that returned to Earth on all missions, because it had to, was the command module in which the 3 astronauts were coming back from wherever they were. Every single one. Now, the only part that has been put on display of any of these Apollo missions, from Apollo 8, 10, 11, right the way through, is the command module. You can go and see it. There's one in London. It's the Apollo 10 command module at the Science Museum in London. The Apollo 11 command module, I believe, is on display in Washington. Where is the Apollo 13 command module on display? And how many of them are there on display? Apollo 13. 2. There are 2 Apollo command modules on display claiming to be Apollo 13. One is at the Kansas Cosmodrome, and the other is at the Grand Rapids Museum in Michigan.
Wrote about it.
Right. Now, okay, Parrots, here's your mission, should you choose to accept it. Explain why there are 2 Apollo 13 command modules on permanent display. Why is one of them sealed? Answer that. You're so informed about the Apollo missions, Parrots, you should know the answer to that straight off the top of your head. I want to hear it. Come on, let's hear it. What's the answer? Why are there 2 Apollo 13 command modules on public display?
Marcus, I want to just backtrack just for a second. I just want to make sure I had his name right. It's Robert A. Brannick, and I believe it's not, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, it's Braeunig. And he produced a paper on the Van Allen belts, and he got into an online public spat back and forth with Gerald White. And Gerald White really demolished him on this in his videos, and I talk about that in the book. Anyway, that was just a sidebar, just to backtrack. But yes, you're right about the Apollo 13, 2 command modules, and that's a very interesting story. We'll save that for the next video. I found that one of the most fascinating parts of the whole Apollo mission, as you were saying with Apollo 13, the 2 Apollo 13s, and the involvement of the Soviet Union in this, and this, oh man, it is like a James Bond novel. I mean, when you read it, and it's all factual. They have documented photos of it. They have a U.S. Coast Guard involved. They have a Russian sub that was stalking the Apollo 13 launch. You've got the Russians that actually picked this capsule up the next day in the Atlantic. You've got a U.S. Coast Guard cutter that went to Minsk to pick up this thing. It's all documented. There's going back and forth between the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union and the Soviet government at that time. I mean, this reads better. I don't know why they haven't made a James Bond movie out of this. This would be a fascinating movie, don't you think?
It was Moonraker alluded to it. The same way Diamonds Are Forever alluded to the moon landings.
Yeah.
And he was checking his radiation meter, if you remember.
Yeah.
There are many things that appear in movies. It's called Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, which you've used as the title of your book. Capricorn 1 was Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. People say, no, that was just a film. That was Hollywood put information out in the public so that people are aware of it. Basically, it just shows how clever they all are because they can do it. There are so many films now indicating what was going on with Apollo. Yeah. Because NASA, and by extension America, which is unfortunate because one should separate the two, NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or as I prefer to refer to them, never a straight answer. It was Peter Bassett who had a go at me. How dare you insult these brave people? I said, I'm not insulting anybody. I'm just quoting what the New York Times referred to NASA because he hero worships NASA. He seems to go to America every year and tours around, hires a car, tours around and photographs various sites, claims to have met various astronauts, 2 I think it is, various other people, which seems to him to give him the authority to talk about NASA as if he knows everything that goes on. He's only ever been to a few museums. That doesn't give him any authority to do anything. And he always gets himself in the photograph as well. So it's basically big-headedness.
I read his book, by the way, an earlier edition of his book a couple of years ago. I just shook my head. And it reminds me of Atavisimo's book.
Yeah, Atavisimo.
He devoted an entire, I think, maybe 2 pages to debunking the conspiracy theories around the Van Allen belts. 2 pages. I wrote a whole chapter. He wrote 2 pages.
That's all you know.
And then there's another point I want to bring up with Robert A. Brannock, who wrote a paper on the Van Allen belts, which I can't find. I have a copy of it, but I can't find it online. I don't know where it is. I don't even think it's on his website. I think it was him that went into coined the term quote mining. And the parrots, as you call them, love to come back at it and say, you're quote mining. A quote can undo decades of research. One quote, and we see many examples of that, decades of it. Area 51 might be sort of a vague example of that, where the U.S. government denied its existence for decades, even though you can see it on camera, you can see stuff flying around there, but no, it doesn't exist. When they finally admitted it 20 years ago, he said, yeah, it exists. And there are other examples of that too numerous to go into here, but quote mining is a very integral part of anyone's research. And I might add that the parrots, the NASA proponents, quote mine all the time. They do it themselves. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not putting it down. I said that in my book. There's nothing wrong with quote mining, right? Because it helps to prove a point. And as I said, it has undone, in certain cases, decades of research. And this really makes me laugh when I hear about Jodrell Bank Observatory in the UK was tracking the Apollo missions. Well, what do you think they're going to say? Where do they get their funding from? They get their funding from the British government. Who's an ally of the British government? The United States. You think they're going to come out and rat on their staunch ally and say, no, we didn't see anything? And all this information comes out later. It doesn't come out at the time. They just go back and just make this up and say, well, Jodrell Bank saw this and saw that. They tracked the Apollo 11 lander as it was landing on the lunar surface. Total nonsense. They produced a piece of paper and says, oh, this is what it is. It's on this piece of paper. That's all it is a piece of paper. It proves nothing. And don't expect any disclosure from an observatory that is receiving its funding, probably from corporations too, at least back then, from the British government. It's not going to happen. You have to find another way.
Yeah. One thing about Jodrell Bank, which is near Manchester in central England.
Yeah.
It was built in the mid-1950s, built at the instigation of Bernard Lovell, who was the director of it at the time. And it was funded by, as you say, industry, and also by the University of Manchester, which is funded in turn by the British government, at least it was at the time. There was funding from industry as well. What most people are not aware of is that there are two radio receiving dishes at Jodrell Bank. There's the very big one, over 200 feet in diameter, but there is also another smaller one, about 50 foot in diameter. When we hear the story that Jodrell Bank was tracking the Apollo missions, yes, they were. NASA were on site with all their equipment to ensure that they could track it correctly. But the prime purpose of the Jodrell Bank radio telescope at the time of Apollo 11 was tracking the Soviet craft, which was going there to the moon at the same time, because they were going towards the moon more or less at the same time. And in order that they were not going to interfere with each other, space is a big place, or Luna and Apollo are not particularly large pieces of kit. You wouldn't think they'd interfere with each other, but no, they were worried about it. So the Soviets said, this is our trajectory, this is how we're going to do it, this is the time we're doing it. So NASA knew exactly what was going on. As you say, there was this evidence produced by the Jodrell Bank Radio Observatory, which is basically a piece of graph paper with a line on it, which we're told is the Apollo 11 descent flight onto the lunar surface. And it's so detailed, they say, you can see where Neil Armstrong took over manual control of the craft. Hang on a minute, a bit of logical thinking here. 240,000 miles, how accurate is anything going to be? How accurate is any radar going to be? Radar isn't that accurate.
Yeah.
It can't identify an object 240,000 miles away moving relative to the surface of the moon. It can't identify it. It can identify possibly that there is something there, but not what it's doing, and certainly not the accuracy with which... I could draw a graph like that. It's not difficult. So we're being shown fabricated information.
back then they didn't have the radar capability of tracking an object to and from the moon. They were using telescopes, or apparently they say they were using telescopes, observatories rather. And then there was the Doppler effect, which I talk about in my book. They were using that. That was basically, if I can, for lack of a better way, the details escape me a bit, but it was basically a wave carried on communications where they can track the Apollo missions, the Apollo craft to within 30 meters. But they don't have that. Back then, they didn't have the capability 20, 30, 40, 50,000 miles out from Earth. How the hell is it they have the capability of doing it, as you just described, in detail, on a graph, landing, approaching the lunar surface? And I got accused of saying, well, no way. Randy says no way. It's no way because it's common sense. They didn't have that technology back then. They didn't have the capability of tracking. That's it. That's all there is to it. I say to them, you haven't been able to prove to me or to Marcus or to anyone else that you had that capability. You produced an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a graph on it. That's what you produced.
Yeah, that's all they have. Anybody could produce that graph if they knew how to do it. And the parrots have determined that that is gold dust. That is definitive proof of this alleged landing. It's not definitive proof of anything. The more that they insist that what they talk about is correct, people like Bronig, as you mentioned, Jay Windley, who runs the clavius.org website, Phil Platt, who runs the Bad Astronomy website, they all insist that they know exactly how we've all gone wrong and that they have the only correct answer. No, they don't. I've spoken with Phil Platt. Admittedly, he was in America and I was in Britain, and we were being interviewed. He didn't know the answer to a basic question which I came up with. I thought, well, if he knows about Apollo, he knows about astronomy, he must know the answer to this. I actually met him in London. He was giving yet another talk saying how wonderful NASA were, and Apollo, of course, was the definitive activity of the 20th century, the most exciting science project ever undertaken. Well, how come they've lost all the records? Phil, come on. Can't you find any of them? They're still trying to find the original biometric tapes. They haven't got that. And has anybody ever seen the original photographs, the Apollo photographs? Anybody seen I'm not talking about the copies. That's what we all keep seeing. Yeah. The originals, they're kept under atmospherically controlled conditions at the Johnson Space Center. I don't believe anybody has ever seen them. If they had seen them and described them accurately, I think they might be rather surprised at the amount of work that had gone into creating them in the first place.
It's interesting that you say that, because when you were talking about this just now, I was thinking about the records for the Saturn V and the F1 engines. And I know that the F1 engines, of course, a lot of those records should have been with Rocketdyne, who took over the design and building and manufacture of the F1 engines, 1958, 59. But something interesting came up in book one when I was writing part one, and I was looking into the records. I've been asked, well, did I go down there myself? Did I go to the archives? Did I search it? And then I came across, no, I didn't. It's impossible sometimes to fly all over the place. You need a lot of resources for that. And I did actually go to some of the museums. I put some photos in the book two. You know, I snuck in New York when they weren't looking. I jumped over the barrier and went up to the replica of the lunar module, and I asked my wife to, take a picture. Here I am, right? So when the staff weren't looking, because you're not supposed to do that, but I didn't care. I just went in and got it and put it in the book. But when you were talking about the records, there was a space historian that went down there and looked in the archives, and he found huge gaps. And he's a proponent of the Apollo missions, and still is, but he admitted there are huge gaps within the Apollo record. And then somebody said to me, well, but it's all on microfilm. No, it's not, because he checked that out too, and again, that's documented in part one, and the microfilm has huge gaps for the design of the Saturn V rocket and, of course, the F1 engines. And this brings me right back to what you were talking about earlier with the telemetry tapes. All of that information for the Saturn V, all of it, the launch right up to the landing, right when they supposedly splashed down, well, something splashed down in the ocean, we saw the news footage, is gone. All of the performance of the F1 engines would have been on those telemetry tapes. All of it. What about the performance going back to 1961? Where is that data? All of those tapes are gone. The only data that you can rely on when it comes to the F1 engines is the 1959 data by Rocketdyne itself, where they were able to get, and don't quote me in the exact time, it's about a millisecond, a static test that produced about just over a million pounds of thrust. And they were able to maintain it for way less than a second. It was not very long. And that's one engine, and that is a static test. We're not talking about the cluster of 5 F1 engines that were put together. We're not talking about the actual forces acting on the F1 engines while it was lifting off the launch pad up to, 40 miles where it was jettisoned. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about the 1959 data. That's the only data I have been able to find that can maybe be substantiated. Anything after that cannot be. Because, as you said, Marcus, correctly, all of the telemetry tapes are gone. And they're not just gone, they were destroyed. I made that determination in book 1. NASA signed these tapes out in the 1970s. That is not open for dispute. That's a fact. They didn't follow their own procedures. They were supposed to sign it out, and the person's name who was taking these out, and we're talking a couple of a warehouse full of tapes. Then we're talking 140,000 telemetry tapes here that are gone. The archives know that NASA signed them out, but they don't know specifically who in NASA gave the authorization and who took those tapes out. The tape shortage didn't happen until the early mid-1980s, which is being used as an excuse to justify the missing telemetry tapes.
One point I'd just like to make, not so much about what we've been talking about, it's to do with the original of the Saturn V rocket. The original was the V2, the German Vengeance 2 rocket. That's why it's called V2. It was built in Germany at Nordhausen in 1944, and 1,000 or 1,100 of them were launched towards London.
Yes.
Quite a few landed, had a ton of high explosive on the front. One of the points made, I won't name the person who made it because it'll only embarrass him even more. So I was talking about the V2 rocket. Would a rocket displace soil? Would it make a mark on the ground? Would it make a crater if you launch a rocket from the ground? And also if you land a rocket on the ground, like the Apollo missions were landing on the moon, would it leave a mark on the surface? And the obvious answer is yes, it would. And there are plenty of pictures showing it. But when the Apollo 11 rocket and all the other Apollo missions landed, they didn't appear to leave any mark on the surface where they'd landed. And this person who claimed that the V2 rocket didn't leave a mark when it took off, which is correct, there was no mark left. It was quite a powerful rocket, it had 25 tons of thrust when this thing took off. Just to illustrate the lack of research that people do, and they make these statements. Why didn't the V2 rocket leave a mark on the ground when it took off? The purpose of it was being portable. It could be launched from anywhere. Middle of a field, middle of a wood. Most of them were launched in forests, so they couldn't be spotted before they launched. So why didn't they leave a mark on the ground? 25 tons of thrust is quite a lot of thrust. And the reason is because each V2 had a launch table that it sat on. It's about 3 foot high. It's about 4 foot in diameter, 30 foot high. And it sat on a launch table. This launch table was brought in as a separate unit, put in there. The V2 rocket was put on top of it. And underneath the launch table was what's called the launch platform. The launch platform weighed over a ton. It was steel, about 1 inch thick. And in the middle of this launch platform was a pyramid-shaped deflector. So it would deflect the exhaust from the rocket sideways. It wouldn't go straight down. Any rocket today you see taking off will have a launch deflector where the exhaust from the rocket taking off goes into an exhaust tunnel, I think they call it, exhaust channel, and it's directed away. So unless you do the research, you sometimes get these things wrong, and the more you get wrong, the more you indicate you don't know what you're talking about. And this particular person doesn't know what he's talking about, because he made that stupid comment that the V2 didn't leave a mark when it took off, therefore it wouldn't apply to the moon either. No, it does. Of course it applies to the moon.
My point is, there's your research. That's how it's done, Peter. That's how it's done, okay? It's not just doing it in a lab and in a classroom and, flying around the world and trying to impress children and anyone else you can think of. It's about actually getting into the meat and potatoes. It's doing the research, sourcing your material, all right? And, yes, offering also your own analysis. He doesn't do that.